Elena Moretti had learned to become invisible, not in a magical way, but in the way that people who serve the rich often do. She moved through the enormous ballroom with a tray of champagne glasses, her black uniform crisp and spotless, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun. 28 years old, and she had mastered the art of being there without really being seen. The Ashford Foundation Gala was the event of the season in Manhattan. Every year, the city's wealthiest families gathered in this historic hotel ballroom to celebrate their charitable contributions and, more importantly, to see and be seen. The room sparkled with more money than most people would earn in 10 lifetimes. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls, throwing rainbow patterns across the polished marble floor. Women wore gowns that cost more than a car, their necks and wrists glittering with diamonds. Men stood in groups discussing business deals over $1,000 bottles of wine. Elena weaved between them all, offering drinks, collecting empty glasses, always moving. She had worked for Prestige Catering for 3 years now, ever since her life had taken an unexpected turn. The work was honest, if exhausting. 5 nights a week, sometimes 6 during the busy season, she put on this uniform and disappeared into the background of other people's glamorous lives. Tonight's event was particularly grand. The Ashford family had spared no expense. Ice sculptures shaped like swans sat on every table, slowly melting under the warm lights. A string quartet played soft classical music in one corner, though hardly anyone listened. The smell of expensive perfume mixed with the aroma of gourmet food being prepared in the kitchen. Elena had peeked at the menu earlier. Dishes she couldn't pronounce. Ingredients she'd never tasted. She approached a group of women clustered near one of the tall windows. They were discussing vacation homes, comparing notes on the Hamptons versus Martha's Vineyard. Elena held out her tray without a word. One woman took a glass without looking at her, without pausing her conversation for even a second. This was normal. Elena had grown used to being treated like a piece of furniture. Mrs. Victoria Ashford, the evening's host, stood near the center of the room like a queen holding court. At 72, she was still a force to be reckoned with. Her silver hair was styled perfectly. Her navy blue gown elegant and understated in a way that only truly expensive clothing can be. She was talking to a group of donors, thanking them for their generosity, while somehow making it clear that she expected even more next year. Elena moved closer to refill Victoria's glass. The older woman barely glanced at her, continuing her conversation about a new wing being added to the children's hospital. Elena poured the champagne with steady hands, a skill she'd perfected over countless events. Not too fast, not too slow. Never spill, never interrupt, never make yourself noticed. As she stepped back, Elena let her eyes wander around the room. This was another skill she'd developed, observing without being caught observing. She'd learned so much about these people just by listening. Who was having an affair? Whose business was struggling? Which marriages were falling apart behind the perfect smiles? The servers always knew the real stories. But Elena had her own story, one she kept carefully hidden. These people saw her as just another waitress, someone to fetch their drinks and clear their plates. They had no idea that 3 years ago she'd been one of them, in a way. Not wealthy, never that, but she'd belonged to their world of education and ambition. She'd been a doctoral student at Columbia University, studying art history with a focus on Renaissance paintings. Her dissertation had been about forgeries, about how to spot fake masterpieces that fooled even experts. She'd loved that work, spent countless hours in libraries and museums, traveling to Italy on a small research grant to examine paintings in person. Her professors had told her she had a brilliant future ahead of her. Academic journals were interested in publishing her research. She'd been on track to become Dr. Elena Moretti, professor and art authentication expert. Then her mother got sick, cancer. the kind that required aggressive treatment and experimental drugs that insurance wouldn't cover. Elena had watched the medical bills pile up like snow in a blizzard. Her father had died when she was 15, so it was just the two of them. She'd made the only choice she could. She dropped out of Columbia, took the catering job because it paid more than teaching assistant work, and started sending every spare dollar to cover her mother's treatment. That was 3 years ago. Her mother was in remission now, thank God, but the debt remained. Mountains of it. Elena sent money every month, chipping away at bills that seemed to grow faster than she could pay them. The doctoral program had moved on without her. Her research sat unfinished in boxes under her bed in Queens, in the tiny apartment she could barely afford. She didn't let herself think about it too much. What was the point? Life had happened, and she'd done what needed to be done. Most days, she was fine with her choice. Some days, though, when she saw these people with their effortless wealth and endless opportunities, she felt a hollowness in her chest that was hard to ignore. Elena returned to the kitchen to refill her tray. The other servers were rushing around, stressed and sweating despite the air conditioning. The head chef was yelling at someone about a sauce. A dropped tray crashed in the corner, and one of the younger servers looked close to tears. Elena helped her pick up the pieces, whispered that it would be okay, then grabbed more champagne and headed back out. The ballroom had filled up even more. Late arrivals were making their entrances, greeting friends with air kisses and compliments that may or may not have been sincere. Elena recognized some faces from previous events. That tech billionaire who always got drunk and handsy. The real estate developer who tipped well but talked down to everyone. The old money families who looked down on the new money families, a hierarchy Elena found both fascinating and absurd. She was offering drinks to a group near the entrance when she felt it, that prickle on the back of her neck that told her someone was watching her. She looked up and immediately wanted to disappear through the floor. Standing in the doorway, shaking hands with Victoria Ashford, was Senator Richard Pemberton. He was a regular at these events, always surrounded by staff and admirers. But it wasn't the senator who had caught Elena's attention. It was the man standing just behind him, the senator's chief of staff, Diego Chen. She'd known him at Columbia. They'd taken several seminars together, worked on a research project about Baroque art. He'd been kind, brilliant, and they'd been friends. Good friends, actually, before everything fell apart. And now he was here, in this ballroom, and any second he was going to look around and see her. Diego would recognize her, of that she had no doubt. The question was, what would happen next? Would he be surprised? Pitying? Would he make a scene? Elena turned quickly, trying to blend into the crowd, hoping to make it back to the kitchen before he spotted her. But she wasn't fast enough. Even across that enormous room, even after 3 years, Diego's eyes found hers. She watched his expression change. Confusion, then recognition, then shock. He stopped walking, causing someone behind him to stumble. His mouth opened slightly, and Elena knew exactly what he was thinking. What happened to you? Everything was about to change. The invisible waitress was about to become very, very visible. Elena's first instinct was to run. Just turn around, walk straight to the kitchen, grab her coat, and leave through the service entrance. She could text her supervisor later with some excuse about feeling sick, but her feet wouldn't move. She stood frozen in the middle of the ballroom, holding a tray of champagne glasses, watching Diego Chen make his way through the crowd toward her. He moved with purpose, excusing himself from the senator's group, his eyes never leaving her face. Elena felt her cheeks growing hot. Other servers had learned long ago not to let friends or family acknowledge them during events. It was unprofessional, drew unwanted attention. But Diego either didn't know that rule or didn't care. Elena? His voice was exactly as she remembered it. Warm, slightly surprised, genuinely pleased. Elena Moretti? I can't believe it's you. Several nearby guests turned to look. Elena felt their eyes on her, felt the weight of suddenly becoming visible when she'd worked so hard to blend into the background. She managed a tight smile, trying to signal with her eyes that this wasn't the time or place. But Diego, sweet and oblivious as always, didn't pick up on her discomfort. I thought you were finishing your doctorate, he continued, his smile fading slightly as he took in her uniform, the tray in her hands. Weren't you doing that amazing research on Renaissance forgeries? Your work on identifying fake Caravaggios was brilliant. Professor Mitchell used to rave about your papers. Elena wanted the floor to swallow her whole. More people were listening now. She could feel their curiosity like heat from a fire. A woman in a green silk dress had stopped mid-conversation to stare. Two men in expensive suits were watching with interest. And worst of all, she could see Celeste Ashford, Victoria's daughter, drifting closer with the predatory look of someone who'd just caught the scent of gossip. Things changed, Elena said quietly, trying to keep her voice steady. I had to leave the program. Family circumstances. Diego's face filled with concern. Oh no, I'm so sorry. Is everything okay? Are you planning to go back? Because honestly, Elena, you were one of the brightest people in our cohort. The academic world needs voices like yours. He meant well. Elena knew that. Diego had always been kind, encouraging, the type of person who genuinely wanted others to succeed. But right now, his kindness felt like spotlights blazing down on her, exposing everything she'd tried to hide. She was about to make another excuse, to find some way to end this conversation, when Celeste Ashford's voice cut through the air like a knife. How absolutely fascinating. Celeste was 42 but looked younger, thanks to what was obviously excellent plastic surgery. She had her mother's sharp features and her father's cruel streak. Elena had served at enough of these events to know that Celeste lived for moments like this, opportunities to make others squirm while she entertained the crowd. From doctoral candidate to cocktail waitress, Celeste continued, her voice dripping with false sympathy. What a remarkable journey that must have been. Do tell us more. A few people laughed. It was polite laughter, the kind that comes more from social obligation than genuine amusement, but it stung all the same. Elena felt her jaw tighten. Years of service training kicked in. She kept her face neutral, her posture professional, never let them see you hurt, never give them the satisfaction. I'm sure we all make choices based on our circumstances, Diego said, jumping to her defense. Elena was doing groundbreaking work on art authentication. She was writing her dissertation on forgery detection methods that could revolutionize how museums verify their collections. Was being the key word, Celeste said, taking a champagne glass from Elena's tray without looking at her. I suppose not everyone has what it takes to finish what they start. Academic rigor isn't for everyone, is it? More laughter rippled through the growing audience. Elena noticed that even some of the other servers had paused in their work to watch. This was becoming a scene, exactly what she'd feared. Her supervisor would be furious. She'd probably get written up for this, maybe even fired for causing a disruption. Though you are quite good at carrying trays, Celeste added, examining her champagne glass as if it were the most interesting thing in the room. Everyone has their talents, I suppose. Some of us contribute to society through philanthropy and cultural preservation. Others bring drinks to those doing the real work. Elena's hands gripped the tray so hard her knuckles turned white. She'd dealt with rude guests before, had developed a thick skin over 3 years of catering. But something about this particular humiliation, about being mocked for the sacrifice she'd made to save her mother's life, made anger burn in her chest like swallowed fire. Still, she said nothing. What could she say? Celeste was right in a way. Elena had given up her dreams. She was serving drinks while her former classmates published papers and attended conferences. The life she'd worked so hard to build had crumbled. And here she was, proof that sometimes hard work and talent weren't enough. "Leave her alone, Celeste." The voice came from an unexpected source. Victoria Ashford had joined their circle, her expression stern. "There's no need to be unkind." For a moment, Elena felt a flicker of hope, but then Victoria continued, and that hope died. "At least she can still appreciate great art, even if she couldn't make it as a scholar." The older woman gestured toward the far wall of the ballroom, where an enormous painting hung in a gilded frame. "Our new acquisition, a Caravaggio. $30 million, but worth every penny to share such beauty with the world." The painting. Elena's eyes fixed on it, and everything else seemed to fade away. She'd seen photographs of it online when the Ashford Foundation announced the acquisition 6 months ago. At the time, she'd been suspicious, had even drafted an email to the foundation warning them to get additional authentication, but she'd never sent it. Who would listen to a college dropout working as a waitress? Now, seeing it in person, she was certain. Completely, absolutely certain. "That's not a Caravaggio," she said. The words came out before she could stop them. The room went quiet. Even the string quartet seemed to pause, though they probably hadn't. Elena looked up to find everyone staring at her. Victoria's face had gone from condescending sympathy to shock, then quickly to anger. "I beg your pardon?" Elena knew she should back down. Should apologize, claim she misspoke, return to the kitchen and pray she still had a job. But something inside her had broken. She was tired of being invisible. Tired of pretending she was less than she was, and she was absolutely tired of watching these people throw away $30 million on a fake painting while she scraped by on minimum wage plus tips. "That painting," Elena said, her voice growing stronger. "It's not a Caravaggio, it's a forgery. And I can prove it." The gasps were audible now. Celeste's mouth hung open in shock. Diego was watching her with wide eyes, recognition dawning on his face as he remembered her expertise, and Victoria Ashford looked like she'd been slapped. "How dare you?" Victoria said, her voice shaking with rage. "That painting was authenticated by 3 separate experts. The provenance is impeccable. We paid $30 million. "Then you were robbed," Elena said simply. She set down her tray on a nearby table. Her hands were shaking now, adrenaline flooding her system, but her mind was clear, clearer than it had been in 3 years. She walked toward the painting, and the crowd parted for her like water. The massive canvas dominated the wall, lit by carefully positioned spotlights. It depicted the martyrdom of Saint Sebastian, the saint tied to a post and pierced with arrows. The dramatic lighting, the rich colors, the emotional intensity, it all looked like Caravaggio's work at first glance, but Elena knew better. "Look at the shadows," she said, pointing without touching the canvas. Caravaggio was a master of chiaroscuro, the contrast between light and dark. But these shadows are wrong. The pigment composition isn't right for the early 1600s. Modern synthetic ultramarine wasn't invented until the 1800s. But I can see it here in the shadow tones. "That's absurd," Victoria sputtered. "Our experts would have caught something like that." "Your experts relied on provenance documents and stylistic analysis," Elena continued, her years of research pouring out of her. "But provenance can be faked. I spent 2 years studying the Castellano workshop, a group of forgers active in the 1920s in Rome. They specialized in Caravaggio forgeries and were brilliant at it. But they had a tell. They always used slightly anachronistic materials because they couldn't help showing off their technical skills with modern pigments." Diego pulled out his phone, his fingers flying across the screen. "She's right about the Castellano workshop," he said, his voice filled with awe. "There are 3 known forgeries attributed to them, all supposedly painted by Caravaggio. One was exposed in 1994, another in 2003. I identified a possible 4th forgery in my thesis research," Elena said, looking directly at Victoria. A painting matching this description, with a provenance gap during the 1920s that coincided with Castellano's known activity. I found records of it being sold to a private collector in 1927, then nothing until it resurfaced in 2019. That gap is exactly when Castellano was most active. The room had erupted into whispers. People were pulling out phones, taking pictures of the painting, of Elena. Celeste had gone pale, backing away from the scene she'd started. And Victoria Ashford looked like she might faint. "This is preposterous," Victoria said, but her voice lacked conviction now. "You're just a waitress. You have no credentials. No authority to make such claims." "You're right," Elena said. "I'm just a waitress. But 3 years ago, I was a doctoral candidate who spent every waking hour studying exactly this type of fraud. And that painting is a fake. Run a spectroscopic analysis on the pigments. Do an X-ray fluorescence test. Check the brushstroke patterns against Caravaggio's documented technique. I'll stake my reputation on it." "What reputation?" Celeste said weakly, but no one was listening to her anymore. Diego stepped forward, his face serious. "Senator Pemberton has a friend on the board of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Their conservation department has equipment that can test Elena's claims. If she's right about the pigments, they'll be able to prove it within 24 hours. Victoria Ashford sank into a nearby chair, suddenly looking every one of her 72 years. The party had ground to a complete halt. Servers stood frozen with trays, guests huddled in groups, their voices rising in excited speculation. And Elena stood in front of the painting, her heart pounding, knowing that her life had just changed forever. She just wasn't sure yet if it had changed for better or worse. The next 20 minutes felt like a dream to Elena, or maybe a nightmare. She couldn't quite tell which. Victoria Ashford had disappeared into a side room with her lawyer, her accountant, and the foundation's art consultant, who'd been summoned from wherever he'd been enjoying his evening. Through the closed door, Elena could hear raised voices, though she couldn't make out the words. The party had fractured into dozens of smaller conversations, all buzzing with speculation about the painting, about the waitress who'd called it a fake, about how much money might be at stake. Elena stood off to the side, no longer holding a tray, no longer invisible, but not quite sure what she was supposed to be doing. Her supervisor, Linda, had pulled her aside earlier with a look of pure confusion. "I don't know what's happening here," Linda had said, "but don't leave. Mrs. Ashford wants to speak with you, and Elena, whatever this is about, please tell me you're not making this up." "I'm not," Elena had assured her. "I know what I'm talking about." Linda had nodded slowly, then walked away shaking her head, probably wondering how a simple catering job had turned into whatever this was. Diego had stayed close to Elena, acting almost like a bodyguard against the curious stares and whispered comments. He'd made several phone calls, speaking quietly to people he described as experts who could help verify Elena's claims. Between calls, he kept looking at her with this expression of amazement mixed with concern. "I can't believe you've been working as a server this whole time," he said during one break. "Do you know how many times Professor Mitchell asked about you? She kept saying you were the most promising student she'd had in 20 years. Elena felt her throat tighten. "I had to leave, Diego. My mom was dying. The bills were impossible. I didn't have a choice." I know, he said quickly. "I'm not judging. I just wish you'd reached out. Maybe we could have helped somehow. There are emergency funds, scholarships for situations like yours." "I looked into all of that," Elena said quietly. "It wasn't enough, not even close. This job paid 3 times what I was making as a teaching assistant, and I needed every penny." Before Diego could respond, the side door opened. Victoria Ashford emerged, her face pale but composed. Behind her came a nervous-looking man in his 60s carrying a leather briefcase. This had to be the art consultant. He looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Miss Moretti, Victoria said, her voice cold but controlled. This is Dr. Harold Westbrook. He authenticated our Caravaggio. He has some questions for you. The crowd pressed closer. Elena felt dozens of eyes on her as Dr. Westbrook set his briefcase on a table and pulled out a tablet. He swiped through several screens, then looked up at Elena with an expression that was hard to read. Skeptical, maybe, but also worried. You mentioned the Castellano workshop, he said. That's quite specific knowledge. Most people, even art historians, aren't familiar with their work. I spent 2 years researching them, Elena replied. They were active primarily between 1921 and 1932, operating out of a studio in Rome. 3 of their forgeries have been confirmed. All were attributed to Caravaggio, and all fooled experts for decades. Dr. Westbrook nodded slowly. And you believe this painting is their work because... Elena walked back toward the massive canvas. The crowd followed like she was leading a tour. May I point at specific areas? I won't touch it. Victoria gave a curt nod. Elena began to explain, and it was like the last 3 years fell away. She was back in her element, discussing the thing she loved most in the world. She pointed out the pigment inconsistencies in the shadow work. She explained how Caravaggio's brush strokes had a specific rhythm, a particular way of building up layers of paint that wasn't quite right in this piece. She described the provenance gap and pulled up articles on Diego's phone showing the timeline of Castellano's activity. But it was her final observation that made Dr. Westbrook's face go gray. Look at St. Sebastian's left hand, Elena said, gesturing to where the painted saint gripped the post he was tied to. The anatomy is slightly wrong. The thumb joint bends at an angle that's anatomically impossible unless the hand is broken. Caravaggio was meticulous about anatomy. He used corpses as models to get the details right. But Giovanni Castellano, the primary forger in the workshop, had injured his left hand in a factory accident in 1919. His thumb never healed correctly. In photographs of his later work, you can see that he unconsciously painted hands with that same slight deformity. It's in all 3 of his confirmed forgeries. The silence that followed was absolute. Dr. Westbrook stared at the painting, then at his tablet, then back at the painting. His hands were shaking slightly. How do you know about Castellano's hand injury? He asked. It's in a police report from 1933 when he was finally arrested for fraud in Milan, Elena said. The report is in Italian, stored in the Milan Municipal Archives. I found it during my research trip. I don't think it's ever been translated into English or widely circulated. But once you know to look for it, you can see that deformity in every hand he painted. Dr. Westbrook sat down heavily in a chair. I never saw that. I looked at the provenance, the historical context, the painting style, but I never noticed the hand. Why would you? Elena said, not unkindly. You weren't looking for a Castellano forgery. You were authenticating what you believed to be a genuine Caravaggio. Confirmation bias is powerful. We see what we expect to see. Victoria Ashford had been listening to all of this with a face like carved marble. Now she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. How certain are you? Elena met her eyes. 95%. The technical analysis will give you absolute certainty, but based on what I can see, I'd bet everything I have that this is a forgery. You don't have anything, Celeste muttered from somewhere in the crowd. Someone shushed her. Victoria straightened her shoulders, and Elena saw the steel that had built a charitable empire worth hundreds of millions. Dr. Westbrook, make the arrangements. I want this painting examined by the best forensic art analysts in the country. I want pigment testing, X-rays, infrared photography, everything, and I want it done immediately. The Met can have a team here by tomorrow morning, Diego offered. Senator Pemberton is making calls now. Victoria nodded. Fine. Miss Moretti, I'm going to need you to document everything you just told us. Every detail of your research, every source, every observation. Can you do that? Yes, Elena said. I still have all my thesis notes. I can provide documentation for all of it. Good. Victoria turned to address the room at large. This gala is over. Everyone, please finish your drinks and enjoy the rest of your evening elsewhere. The Foundation will be issuing a statement once we have conclusive results from the testing. People began to move, reluctantly, still buzzing with excitement. This would be the talk of New York society for weeks. Elena heard fragments of conversation as guests filed out. Some people seemed thrilled by the drama. Others were already discussing the financial implications, how this would affect the Foundation's reputation, whether other pieces in the collection might also be fraudulent. Linda appeared at Elena's elbow. I'm going to need you to explain what just happened. I will, Elena promised. But honestly, I'm not entirely sure myself. As the ballroom slowly emptied, Diego stayed by her side. Dr. Westbrook had retreated to a corner, frantically making phone calls. Victoria and Celeste were having what looked like an intense conversation near the entrance, their voices too low to hear, but their body language tense. Elena felt exhausted suddenly, the adrenaline draining away and leaving her shaky and uncertain. She'd just accused one of New York's most powerful families of owning a forgery. She'd humiliated their art consultant in front of hundreds of witnesses. If she was wrong, her life was over. She'd never work in the art world again. She'd probably never work anywhere again. But she wasn't wrong. She knew she wasn't. That painting was a fake, and tomorrow the tests would prove it. Diego seemed to read her thoughts. You did the right thing, he said quietly, even if it's scary. I might have just destroyed my life, Elena said. Or you might have just saved it, he replied. Let's find out which. Within the hour, the ballroom was nearly empty. The catering staff had been dismissed, though Linda told Elena to take the next few days off with pay, given the circumstances. The painting still hung on the wall, but now it was surrounded by velvet ropes, protected until the experts arrived. Victoria approached Elena one final time before leaving. Up close, the older woman looked tired, the careful makeup unable to hide the stress lines around her eyes. I don't know whether to thank you or curse you, Victoria said bluntly. If you're right, you've saved us from displaying a fraud and helped us recover $30 million from whoever sold us this painting. If you're wrong, you've created a public relations disaster and humiliated my family for no reason. I understand, Elena said, and I'm sorry for the way it happened. I didn't plan to make a scene. No, I don't imagine you did, Victoria said. She studied Elena for a long moment. My daughter was cruel to you tonight. I apologize for that. Celeste forgets sometimes that kindness costs nothing. It wasn't a full apology, but it was something. Elena nodded. Be here tomorrow at 9, Victoria continued. When the experts arrive, I want you to walk them through your analysis. And Miss Moretti, I suggest you prepare yourself. If you're right about this, your life is about to change in ways you can't imagine. With that, Victoria Ashford swept out of the ballroom, leaving Elena standing alone in the enormous space, surrounded by melting ice sculptures and half-empty champagne glasses, wondering what she'd just set in motion. Outside the hotel, Diego waited with her for a taxi. The November air was cold, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the ballroom. Elena pulled her thin jacket tighter, realizing she'd left her real coat in the employee locker room. She'd have to get it tomorrow. You should go home and get some sleep, Diego said. Tomorrow is going to be intense. I don't think I can sleep, Elena admitted. What if I'm wrong, Diego? What if I miss something? You're not wrong, he said with certainty. I saw your face when you were analyzing that painting. That was the same expression you used to get in seminars when you'd spotted something no one else had seen. You were always right then. You're right now. A taxi pulled up. Elena climbed in and gave the driver her address in Queens. As the car pulled away, She looked back to see Diego still standing there, watching her go. Tomorrow, she'd find out if her gamble had paid off. Tonight, she was just a waitress who'd spoken up when she should have stayed silent. But maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what needed to happen. Elena didn't sleep that night. She lay in her small apartment in Queens, staring at the ceiling, watching the shadows from passing cars crawl across the walls. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that painting. Saint Sebastian tied to the post, arrows piercing his flesh, that slightly wrong hand gripping the wood. She went over her analysis again and again in her mind, searching for any mistake, any detail she might have gotten wrong. At 3 a.m, she gave up on sleep entirely. She pulled out the boxes from under her bed, the ones containing her unfinished dissertation and 3 years of research. Dust covered the cardboard, and the sight of it made her chest ache. She'd packed these away, thinking she'd never look at them again, that this part of her life was over. Now she spread papers across her tiny kitchen table, finding the sections about the Castellano workshop. There were her notes from the trip to Milan, photocopies of the police report, photographs she'd taken of the confirmed forgeries in museums across Europe. Everything she'd told Victoria Ashford was documented here, evidence she'd gathered when she still believed she had a future in academia. By the time the sun rose, Elena had organized everything into a folder. Her hands trembled slightly as she got dressed. She chose simple black pants and a white blouse, professional but not pretentious. She had no idea what this day would bring, but she wanted to look like someone who should be taken seriously. The taxi ride back to Manhattan felt surreal. Morning traffic clogged the streets, normal people heading to normal jobs, completely unaware that Elena's entire life might be decided in the next few hours. She arrived at the hotel at 8:30, early but too nervous to wait any longer. Diego was already there, standing outside the ballroom with 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Elena without a word. She could have hugged him. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked. "Are you kidding? This is the most exciting thing that's happened in years," he said, then caught himself. "Sorry, I know it's your life on the line. That was insensitive." "No, it's okay," Elena said, managing a small smile. "At least someone's enjoying this." The ballroom looked different in the morning light. The glamour of the previous night had faded, leaving behind a space that seemed too big and too empty. Workers were dismantling the decorations, packing away centerpieces and folding up tables. But the painting still hung on the wall, spotlights illuminating it like it was on trial. Which, Elena supposed, it was. Victoria Ashford arrived at 8:45, accompanied by her lawyer and Dr. Westbrook, who looked like he hadn't slept either. The art consultant avoided making eye contact with Elena, which told her everything she needed to know about how he was feeling. His reputation was at stake, too. If the painting was fake, it meant he'd missed it, that he'd assured the foundation they were buying an authentic masterpiece when they were really buying a forgery. "Miss Moretti," Victoria said, her tone businesslike and cool. "The team from the Metropolitan Museum will be here shortly. They're bringing portable equipment for preliminary testing. More detailed analysis will require removing the painting to their lab, but we should have initial results today." Elena nodded, not trusting her voice. "I read through the materials you emailed last night," Victoria continued. "Your research is thorough, impressively so. Dr. Westbrook has some questions about your methodology." Dr. Westbrook finally looked at her, his expression pained. "The hand deformity you mentioned. I went back through photographs of known Castellano forgeries last night. You're right. It's there in all of them. How did I miss it?" "Because you weren't looking for it," Elena said gently. "You had no reason to suspect Castellano. The provenance documents seemed solid. You were authenticating based on style and historical context, which is standard procedure." "Still," he said, shaking his head, "I should have been more thorough. If you're right about this, I've failed in my duty to the foundation." Before Elena could respond, the museum team arrived. There were 4 of them, led by a woman named Dr. Patricia Okonkwo, who had short gray hair and the confident manner of someone who'd spent decades examining priceless artwork. She shook hands with Victoria, nodded to Dr. Westbrook, then turned to Elena. "You're the one who identified this as a possible Castellano forgery," she asked. "Yes," Elena said. "I read your analysis. It's compelling. Let's see if the science backs you up." The next 3 hours felt like the longest of Elena's life. The team set up their equipment, carefully positioning lights and scanners around the painting. Dr. Okonkwo explained each test as they performed it, her voice calm and professional. They started with high-resolution photography under different light spectrums. Infrared revealed the underdrawing beneath the paint, showing how the artist had planned the composition. Ultraviolet light made certain pigments fluoresce in ways that could indicate their age and composition. Elena watched, barely breathing, as they examined the areas she'd pointed out, the shadows where she suspected modern pigments, the brushwork that didn't quite match Caravaggio's technique, and finally, most importantly, Saint Sebastian's hand. Dr. Okonkwo spent a long time studying that hand through a magnifying device, making small sounds of interest. She called over one of her colleagues, and they conferred in low voices, pointing at specific details. "We'll need to do pigment analysis to be completely certain," Dr. Okonkwo said finally, straightening up. "But based on what I'm seeing, there are definitely anachronisms here. This ultramarine blue in the shadow tones, for instance. The fluorescence pattern suggests it's synthetic, not the natural lapis lazuli pigment that would have been available in Caravaggio's time." Victoria's face remained impassive, but Elena saw her grip tighten on her lawyer's arm. The pigment testing took another hour. They used a device called an X-ray fluorescence spectrometer, which could analyze the chemical composition of the paint without damaging it. Elena knew the theory, had studied it in her coursework, but had never actually seen it used in person. She watched the readings appear on a laptop screen, numbers and graphs that told the story of what materials had been used to create this painting. Dr. Okonkwo reviewed the results with her team, their expressions growing more serious. Finally, she turned to face Victoria and Elena. "The pigment analysis confirms modern synthetic ultramarine in the shadow work," she said. "This pigment wasn't commercially available until 1826. Caravaggio died in 1610. Additionally, we're seeing traces of zinc white, which wasn't used in oil painting until the mid-1800s. There's also evidence of a modern canvas preparation technique that wasn't developed until the 20th century. The room was completely silent. Even the workers who'd been packing up decorations had stopped to listen. "What are you saying?" Victoria asked, though her voice suggested she already knew. "I'm saying this painting is definitely not by Caravaggio," Dr. Okonkwo replied. "Based on the materials and techniques, I'd date it to the early 20th century, which aligns perfectly with Miss Moretti's theory about the Castellano workshop. We'll need to do more detailed analysis to confirm attribution, but there's no question that this is a forgery." Elena felt her knees go weak. She'd been right. She was actually right. Dr. Westbrook made a sound like all the air had left his body. He sat down heavily, his face in his hands. Victoria stood motionless, her expression unreadable. Her lawyer immediately started talking about legal options, about pursuing the gallery that had sold them the painting, about recovering their money. But Victoria held up a hand, silencing him. She walked over to Elena, and for a terrible moment, Elena thought the older woman might actually hit her. Instead, Victoria extended her hand. "Thank you," she said simply. "You've saved the foundation from a tremendous embarrassment. If we'd displayed this painting as genuine for years, eventually someone else would have discovered the truth. The damage to our reputation would have been catastrophic." Elena shook her hand, still feeling like she was in a dream. I need to ask you something, Victoria continued. How much would it cost to complete your doctorate? The question caught Elena completely off guard. I don't understand. Tuition, fees, living expenses. If you were to return to Columbia and finish your degree, how much would you need? Elena did quick math in her head. Maybe $60,000 for 2 years, plus living expenses. But I also have medical debt from my mother's treatment. About $80,000 still outstanding. Victoria didn't even blink. The foundation would like to hire you as a consultant. We need someone to review our entire collection, authenticate every major piece we own. After today, I don't trust anyone else to do it properly. The position would pay $150,000 annually with full benefits. We'd also pay off your mother's medical debt as a signing bonus and provide funding for you to complete your doctorate. Elena stared at her, unable to process what she was hearing. Are you serious? I'm always serious about business, Miss Moretti. You've demonstrated expertise that we desperately need. You're thorough, you're honest, and you're willing to speak up even when it's uncomfortable. Those are rare qualities. I'd be a fool not to hire you. I accept, Elena said, the words tumbling out before she could second-guess herself. Yes, absolutely, I accept. For the first time that morning, Victoria smiled. It wasn't a warm smile, but it was genuine. Good. You'll start Monday. Take the rest of the week to give notice at your current job and handle your affairs. My assistant will send over the contract and arrange for the debt payment. Diego let out a whoop of joy and pulled Elena into a hug, lifting her off her feet. Dr. Okonkwo was smiling too, shaking her head in amazement. Even Dr. Westbrook looked relieved, probably realizing that if the foundation had Elena reviewing their collection, it reflected well on everyone involved. As the museum team packed up their equipment and Victoria stepped away to make phone calls, Elena found herself standing in front of the painting again. Saint Sebastian stared out at her with his expression of serene suffering, unaware that he was a fraud, that he'd been created by a skilled forger almost a century ago. She thought about Giovanni Castellano, whoever he'd been, painting this masterpiece that almost fooled everyone. He'd been talented, incredibly so, just not talented enough to hide every trace of who he really was. That deformed hand, the unconscious signature he'd left in every forgery, had finally given him away. Elena understood something about that. She'd tried to hide who she really was for 3 years, tried to be invisible, tried to pretend she was just a waitress and nothing more. But you couldn't hide your true self forever. Eventually, it came out. Eventually, you had to be who you actually were. She took out her phone and called her mother. It was early, but her mom would be awake, probably sitting in the kitchen with her morning tea. Elena, is everything okay? Everything's perfect, Mom, Elena said, and started to cry. I have so much to tell you. 3 months later, Elena stood in a lecture hall at Columbia University, looking out at a sea of faces. Some were faculty members she'd studied under years ago. Others were graduate students, curious about the woman who'd made headlines by exposing a $30 million forgery. A few were art world professionals, dealers and curators who wanted to hear firsthand about her authentication methods. And in the front row, wearing her best dress and beaming with pride, sat her mother. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the microphone. Public speaking had never been her strength, but this was different. This was her dissertation defense, the moment she'd thought would never come. The moment she'd given up on 3 years ago when life had forced her to make an impossible choice. Except it wasn't impossible anymore. Good afternoon, Elena began, her voice steadier than she felt. Today I'll be presenting my dissertation, titled Shadows of Deception, Authentication Methods for Identifying Early 20th Century Italian Forgeries. This research examines the work of the Castellano workshop and develops a systematic approach for identifying their forgeries, which have fooled experts for nearly a century. She clicked to the first slide, and there it was. The fake Caravaggio from the Ashford Foundation. The painting that had changed everything. A murmur went through the audience. Everyone knew this story. It had been covered by every major news outlet, dissected by art critics, and debated in academic journals. The next hour flew by. Elena walked through her research, explaining how she'd tracked down obscure records in Italian archives, how she'd identified the telltale signs that marked Castellano's work, how materials analysis could confirm what stylistic study suggested. She showed photographs of the confirmed forgeries, pointed out the recurring anatomical quirks, explained the chemistry of anachronistic pigments. The panel of professors asked tough questions, but Elena was ready for all of them. She'd lived with this research for 5 years total, had thought about it even during those 3 years when it seemed lost forever. This knowledge was part of her now, woven into who she was. When she finished, Professor Mitchell, her former advisor, stood up. The elderly woman's eyes were bright with emotion. "Miss Moretti, on behalf of the committee, I'm pleased to inform you that you've successfully defended your dissertation. Congratulations, Dr. Moretti." The room erupted in applause. Elena's mother was crying, wiping her eyes with a tissue. Diego, sitting near the back, let out another one of his characteristic whoops. Even some of the serious academic types were smiling. Dr. Elena Moretti. It felt surreal. She'd actually done it. After the defense, there was a small reception in the department lounge. People crowded around Elena, congratulating her, asking about her work with the Ashford Foundation, requesting her contact information for potential consulting opportunities. It was overwhelming in the best possible way. Professor Mitchell pulled her aside during a quiet moment. "I always knew you'd finish," she said. "Even when you disappeared, I told everyone you'd be back. You were too brilliant, too passionate about this work to stay away forever." "I didn't think I'd ever come back," Elena admitted. "I thought I'd given it up for good." "Sometimes life takes us on detours," Professor Mitchell said. "But if we're meant to do something, we find our way back to it. You're exactly where you're supposed to be." Elena's mother approached, and Professor Mitchell gracefully excused herself. Her mom looked healthier than she had in years, the color back in her cheeks, her eyes clear and bright. The experimental treatment had worked. She was in remission, had been for over a year now, and the doctors were cautiously optimistic. "I'm so proud of you, baby," her mother said, pulling Elena into a tight hug. "Your father would have been so proud, too." "I know, Mom," Elena whispered. "I wish he could have seen this." "He sees it," her mother said firmly. "I'm sure of it." They stood together for a moment, just holding each other, and Elena felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. Yes, the path had been hard. Yes, she'd sacrificed and struggled and almost given up. But she'd made it through. They both had. The following Monday, Elena walked into the Ashford Foundation offices for what had become her normal routine. The foundation occupied an entire floor of a building overlooking Central Park. Her office had a window with a view of the trees, a desk with a computer connected to art authentication databases around the world, and shelves already filling up with reference books and research materials. She'd spent the last 3 months systematically reviewing the foundation's collection. 23 major pieces so far, ranging from Renaissance paintings to Greek sculptures to modern photography. She'd found 2 more potential problems, both much less dramatic than the fake Caravaggio. One was a minor attribution error, a painting labeled as being by a master that was more likely done by a talented student. The other was a sculpture with questionable provenance that needed additional documentation. Victoria had taken each discovery in stride, even seemed to appreciate Elena's thoroughness. The older woman had softened somewhat over the past months, though she still maintained her imperious manner with most people. But with Elena, there was a grudging respect, an acknowledgement that they needed each other. "Dr. Moretti," Victoria said, appearing in Elena's doorway. She'd started using the title even before the dissertation defense, as if willing it into existence. "Do you have a moment?" "Of course," Elena said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. Victoria sat, which was unusual. Normally, she delivered information standing up, as if she couldn't spare the time to sit. "I wanted to tell you before you heard it elsewhere. The lawsuit against the gallery that sold us the fake Caravaggio has been settled. We're recovering the full $30 million, plus damages and legal fees." "That's wonderful news," Elena said. "Yes, it is, and we have you to thank for it. If you hadn't spoken up that night, we'd still have that forgery hanging in our gallery, none the wiser." Victoria paused, looking out the window. "My daughter wanted me to pass along a message." Elena raised her eyebrows. She hadn't seen Celeste since that night at the gala. The woman had made herself scarce, probably embarrassed by her behavior. "She wanted to apologize," Victoria continued, "for how she treated you. It was cruel and unnecessary. Celeste is going through some things, not that it excuses her behavior, but she wanted you to know she regrets it." "I appreciate that," Elena said carefully. "She also wanted you to know that she started volunteering at a literacy program in the Bronx, teaching adults to read. It's given her some perspective, apparently, on judging people based on their circumstances." Victoria's lips curved into a small smile. "I'd like to think your example taught her something about humility." Elena didn't quite know what to say to that. The idea that she'd somehow influenced Celeste Ashford seemed impossible. "Anyway," Victoria said, standing up and returning to her usual brisk manner, "I have a new project for you. There's an estate sale in Connecticut, a private collection that's being liquidated. The family claims they have a Vermeer. I want you to go examine it before the auction house gets involved. Diego Chen has agreed to accompany you since he's familiar with Dutch Golden Age painting." "I'd be happy to," Elena said, already feeling the familiar excitement of a new investigation. After Victoria left, Elena sat at her desk for a moment, just taking it all in. 6 months ago, she'd been invisible, serving champagne to people who looked through her like she didn't exist. Now she had her doctorate, a prestigious position, her mother's health restored, and a future full of possibilities. Her phone buzzed with a text from Diego. "Lunch to celebrate Dr. Moretti? My treat." She smiled and typed back. "Only if we don't go anywhere fancy. I've had enough of fancy for a while." "Queen's Pizza joint it is," he replied. Elena grabbed her coat and headed out, walking through the foundation offices with her head held high. A few staff members congratulated her on the doctorate. She thanked them, realizing that she was visible now in a completely different way. Not because she was serving them, but because they respected her expertise, her knowledge, her contribution. As she waited for the elevator, she thought about that night at the gala. How terrified she'd been, how certain that speaking up would destroy her life. But staying silent would have destroyed her in a different way. She would have kept herself small, kept hiding, kept pretending to be less than she was. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to be invisible. Sometimes you have to risk everything to reclaim who you really are. The elevator doors opened and Elena stepped inside. Her reflection looked back at her from the polished doors. Same face, same dark eyes, same determination that had gotten her through the hardest years of her life. But different, too. Confident, unburdened, free. She thought about all the people working service jobs right now, the ones who were invisible to the people they served, the brilliant minds hidden behind uniforms, the talented people struggling with circumstances beyond their control, the dreamers who'd been forced to defer their dreams. She understood them in a way she never could have before her own journey. Maybe that was the real gift in all of this. Not the job or the doctorate or the money, though those things mattered. The real gift was empathy, understanding, the knowledge that everyone has a story. That waitress serving your coffee might be a genius. That janitor cleaning your office might be an artist. That person you look past without seeing might be exactly the person you need. Elena had been invisible once. Now she saw everything with different eyes. The elevator reached the ground floor, and the doors opened onto a beautiful spring afternoon. Diego was waiting outside, already arguing with a hot dog vendor about whether ketchup belonged on a New York dog. Some things never changed. Elena walked out into the sunshine, into her new life, into a future she'd earned through courage and knowledge and refusing to give up. She'd left the aristocrats speechless once. Now she was just getting started. The quiet waitress had found her voice, and the world was finally listening.